Welcome back to OSTpolitik Studio. My name is Bidzina Lebanidze, and today we have a special guest, Professor Volodymyr Dubovyk. Volodymyr is Professor of International Relations at Odesa University, and he is also the Senior Fellow with the Democratic Resilience Program at the Center for European Policy. Volodymyr, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Bidzina. It's my pleasure.
Thanks. And I want to start our conversation with a personal note. So I had the privilege to co-author the article with Volodymyr a few years ago about Ukraine's geopolitical identity and geopolitical orientation towards Europe. And since then, almost 6 years have passed, and a lot of things happened, including, of course, unfortunately, the major wars that is described differently: war of attrition, war for survival, even as a decolonial war against Russia. And to follow up our points that we made in the article, we are both international relations scholars, and there is this famous model in international relations that wars also transform societies and states. Point made by Charles Tilly is that they make societies more coherent, even they may even have transformative impact on society and state. So now, looking from today's perspective, how much has Ukraine's society changed, or how much the war has changed Ukraine's society if we compare it back to 2022?
I think it has changed a lot. I mean, of course, it's under a lot of pressure because many people who are civil society activists, NGO activists, they stopped doing what they were doing before and went to the war line, so the front line, and started fighting the war. So some of the best minds, especially in the younger generation, have been lost. Many others are focusing exclusively on trying to provide Ukrainian military with what they need for their war effort. So therefore, maybe sometimes at the expense of doing some important work on some other economics, social, political, international issues. But at the same time, the society is influential. So society is influential in Ukraine, still is, even under the situation of the full-scale war. No, naturally, I mean, we have, it's well known, we have a martial law in Ukraine that doesn't prevent, though, from some political activities in the country. For instance, last year, there was a major crisis when President Zelenskyy hinted on cutting their prerogatives and rights and privileges for several anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine. And that was met with protests in Ukraine, basically the first more or less widely organized protests in Ukraine ever since the start of the full-scale war in February 2022. People were not happy about it because people thought that fighting against corruption is still very important for Ukraine, because corruption is still present in Ukrainian life. There have been some measures and steps to eradicate corruption, to fight it, but it's maybe not as widespread as it used to be, but it's still around. So people thought that fighting corruption is important, as well as fighting Russia, because basically those are the two main enemies. And we will always, in Ukraine, we always thought that there is one very important existential external enemy, that is Russia, and there is one very important, also quite existential enemy, which is domestic issues like corruption, like maybe sometimes lack of transparency, like maybe sometimes lack of efficient judicial system and things like that. So therefore, I think the process of Europeanization in Ukraine, it never stopped after February of 2022. Moreover, many people tend to frame the war against Russian aggression not only as a defensive war for Ukrainian territory, for Ukrainian sovereignty, but also for European future of Ukraine. And in that respect, it's a direct continuation, really, from two Maidans: the Orange Revolution first, and then the Revolution of Dignity, Euromaidan. Second is basically continuation of Ukrainians' struggle for their freedoms and rights and democracy and things like free and fair elections and free speech and things like that. because it's in many ways you see, some people call it's a Ukrainian-Soviet war, because what Russia represents in many ways is a remnant of the Soviet system, well, plus many other types of ideologies put together in a strange brew by Mr. Putin. But Ukraine really wants to get closer to the rest of the European family of nations in this war, not only just not to be defeated, but also to be able to join European integration process. And in many ways, Ukraine is a part of it. And that's why it's really nice to see that Ukraine has been given the status of the candidate country to join European Union. The negotiations have been then opened for Ukraine at some point of time joining European Union. Now there might be some discussions about how and when Ukraine would join or should join. There are some discussions on the Ukrainian side. There are some discussions on the European side. Some people even say maybe 2027. But others say, well, it's too fast, so maybe we wouldn't be able to join European Union that soon. But anyhow, what is important is there is a discussion within the society. So not only on the subject of Ukrainian troops fighting Russian aggressors, but also on the subject of Ukraine working and walking towards its European future. So Ukraine wants to not only withstand that war, but Ukraine also wants to be a normal, civilized, democratic, prosperous European country. In that respect, Ukrainian civil society is still there, and in that respect, Ukrainian civil society is still an important factor and a force to reckon with for the government, and speaks the minds of Ukrainian population.
Thank you so much, Volodymyr. You touched many points also from my second question, but I still want to zoom in on a little bit. So the impact of the war and also of European integration also on political system of Ukraine. So for outside observers, many things have changed also in this regard. For instance, the role of oligarchs have somehow declined. But at the same and at the same time, sorry,
go ahead.
And at the same time, okay, we hear here and there about corruption scandals, but also situation has been improving in this regard. So how much has Ukraine's political system also changed as a result of war and as a result of accompanying transformation?
Yeah, to conclude with corruption subject, maybe I should say that yes, there's maybe less corruption than it used to be in Ukraine, but there's still plenty. And of course, the current circumstances of the war effort also give some people, with bad character, an opportunity to steal, an opportunity to misuse and abuse some funds. By the way, it's not really concerning the Western assistance coming to Ukraine because it's more tightly monitored. Moreover, often the Western money is being spent on buying Western weapons and being sent to Ukraine, so Ukraine doesn't even have much of a say in terms of how to spend Western assistance often. But mostly it was Ukrainian own budget and national budget, which sometimes being misappropriated and abused and misused. So there's more transparency now. I think we hear more about the scandals and this scams and schemes because there is more transparency, there was less, and that's why we didn't hear much. But now we hear immediately, almost there is someone leaking, it's immediately becomes known. And that really creates a problem for Ukrainian society because people think we have this existential war for our future, and then behind the backs of our heroic soldiers, someone is stealing the money, including stealing some money that is appropriated for Ukrainian army. This is absolutely unacceptable. This is tedious. This is really something which is really ugly, and we have to deal with it. And of course, in our dealing with our international partners and supporters, that's also hurts Ukraine when they hear the scandals, because it brings a question like, can we continue to help Ukraine if there is some money which is misused? But with Ukrainian society, it has changed in some ways. Martial law is something to deal with. Of course, the very introduction of martial law was absolutely natural, inevitable event in Ukrainian history when Russian massive aggression started. No one is even debating if the martial law should have been introduced, and that it limits by itself certain democratic suspense, certain democratic rules and principles in the society. Like one of the most visible, of course, is that Ukrainian men between 18 and 60 are actually eligible to, they have to join the war effort, except for quite recent decision by Zelenskyy that younger people between 18 and 23 can actually go abroad, but everyone else can't, and therefore it's really hard on some people, especially in a situation when some families go abroad, like wife and kids, and men stay behind in Ukraine. So that's families that are really detached one from another. But going forward, I think oligarchs have lost some of their influence, and they've lost some of their money. They've lost some of their capital because of fighting. Obviously, many factories and plants and mines have been destroyed, and therefore people like Akhmetov or Pinchuk and some others, they have lost some of the money they had because of destruction, because most of the industrial base of Ukraine is in the south and, of course, the east primarily. That's exactly where most of the fighting is taking place. So that's only by this objective reason they have already lost some influence. And then also in a wartime, the president has more war powers, and he deals often, limiting the influence of oligarchs.
Thanks so much, Volodymyr, for this exhaustive response. I want to ask about the societal, but also political attitudes about the war, and specifically also about war fatigue. Is there the war fatigue in the society, but also in the political class? And we have been observing all the time the negotiations with Russia, also with participation of United States. And from the Ukrainian viewpoint, so what are those very minimal positions on which Ukraine would agree to ceasefire, and what is also the most absolute pain threshold that for Ukraine would be unacceptable in order to make a deal with Russia?
Yeah, that's of course the question of the day, as they say, for the $1 million, but actually it's for much more than $1 million. But Ukraine is, of course, very eager to go back to peaceful times for this war to end. No one suffers from this war more than Ukrainians, and not only people who are in harm's ways, who are very close to the front line, or people who are in Ukrainian trenches on the front line, but also any other Ukrainians, Ukrainian who finds themselves as the internally displaced persons, or maybe under temporary protection somewhere outside of Ukraine. Everyone's lives were affected, interrupted, in many ways ruined, and that's why, of course, Ukrainians really, really badly want to have peace. But at the same time, there is this understanding that the peace can and should be rather fair, and also viable and sustainable. So with fairness, we are kind of saying goodbye for now to the fair peace, because we understand that's probably we're not going to get it, because a fair peace would mean a return of all Russian occupied lands to Ukraine. It would include the punishment for everyone in the Russian military forces and political leadership for war crimes they have committed. And it would include the return of all kidnapped Ukrainian children. It would return the compensation, financial compensation to Ukraine, the reparation for the damage they've done to Ukrainian land and Ukrainian economy. So we understand that right now we probably are not going to speak about this fair peace. It's not going to be possible, but still, we at least want to have a viable peace that would be sustainable, that can stay, that can actually be in place for some period of time. So we don't want to have some kind of a peace agreement or even a ceasefire that would embolden Putin to continue his aggression, and that would leave Ukraine without the means to defend itself better, if Putin decides, or someone else in his place in Russia decides to continue the aggression. So therefore, that's why the onus now, the focus is really on security guarantees for Ukrainians. If you sign some kind of a treaty or agreement or ceasefire agreement, how would our security be guaranteed? Who's going to do it? By what means? Can we actually believe in this? Are we going to have some kind of committing guarantees or not? What will happen with security assistance to Ukraine? Will we continue to get humanitarian assistance, weapons or money for weapons? and also, assistance in energy sphere and many other spheres that Ukraine need right now because being heavily bombed by Russian missiles and drones. So this is something that Ukrainians reckon with, and there is no trust to Putin whatsoever, or Russia for that matter. And that's why people think, well, if we do it the wrong way, we'll just let Putin to have a pause, operational pause, get more troops, get more weapons. They will have money. Maybe some sanctions will be taken off Russia. They'll have more money to find their war against Ukraine because their purposes, the objectives that they formally often state hasn't changed. They still want Ukraine under their full control, not within Russian Federation, but in their sphere of control. They still want Ukraine not to be pro-Western and not to be anti-Russian. They still want Ukraine with a strict sovereignty and independence. So, and the very existence of Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language is being doubted by them, and they never stopped. So, therefore, for Ukraine, the war is really not a dilemma of stopping when we want to stop, because we might say, okay, we're stopping, we're dropping our weapons, but that wouldn't mean the end of the war because Russia would be continuing the war. So, therefore, we in Ukraine are really in this difficult dilemma. On one hand, you have this never-ending bloody war. On the other hand, you have, if you just suddenly stop resisting, then Putin's troops would just go deeper into Ukraine, which is also even worse scenario.
Volodymyr, thanks so much. So I want to ask specifically about, you mentioned security guarantees. So here I want to bring in also United States and the European Union. So on the one hand, the United States approach has changed a lot under Trump administration. So the question is, what kind of security guarantees can the United States provide that are credible, that Ukrainians can trust, not just probably some signed paper, but something more credible. On the other hand, also, when we think about Europeans, are Europeans capable to provide security guarantees that will deter Russia from further aggression? So what are, in your opinion, this kind of security guarantees that will truly deter Russia from further escalation?
Yeah, that's another great question, obviously, Bidzina, because of course we don't want a repetition of the Budapest Memorandum from 1994. When Ukraine were promised some assurances of security, but didn't get anything meaningful. It was just a piece of paper, like you said. Unfortunately, Ukrainian political class and Ukrainian political leadership have lived for years, if not decades, under the illusion that somehow we are projected, maybe, but that memorandum when we were not. And Ukrainian experts in the field actually were always ringing the alarm, or raising the alarm and saying, well, look, this is not enough. We need to think about other things. And primarily, people thought about membership in NATO, which was maybe even possible for Ukraine at some point of time, but that didn't happen, unfortunately. So Ukraine was left in the worst situation, in the sense of being in this security limbo, in a gray zone between enhanced NATO on one hand, enhanced and enlarged and NATO on one hand, and more aggressive, imperialistic, and belligerent Russia. And therefore, we're now seeing this war, which is raging already for the 13th year, if you count the first stage from 2014 when Crimea was taken and the war in Donbass started. That's why right now, of course, we want something better. But what Ukraine wants, most of our allies probably are not able to give to us. Well, first of all, we would rather be members in NATO. Probably not going to happen right now. And unfortunately, here we are talking about, in many ways, our entwined history on NATO and EU between Georgia and Ukraine. For many years, we went together as a duo, as a tandem of countries who were both aspiring to get closer to EU and NATO membership, and implemented many conditions and met criteria and so on. But then for different reasons, obviously, neither Georgia nor Ukraine are not necessarily in position to be able to get to both of these organizations anytime soon. So with the absence of immediate opportunity or prospect for Ukraine to join NATO, then we still need to work close with NATO, because basically it's in many ways NATO countries provide Ukraine with so much assistance right now that Ukraine is almost like a de facto member of NATO, except for there is of course no Article 5. There's no collective defense. So no one in NATO wants to fight for Ukraine the war against Russia. So they don't want to cross this red line of having direct confrontation, military confrontation with Russia. So here, nothing will probably change. But if Ukraine wants assistance, we have already signed bilateral agreements on assistance with a number of countries, numbering something like 30 countries. Many of them have told us that they're going to continue to support us for a long period of time. There is a plan. There is a numbers of amounts that will be given to Ukraine. The weapons are flowing to Ukraine. And to conclude the answer to this question, in many ways, European assistance is even more meaningful right now than American one, because since change of administrations in the United States, President Trump basically fulfilling his promise to cut support for Ukraine. What American weapons are we getting right now? Those are the weapons that Europeans buy from US and give it to Ukraine. That's how it works. So there is no direct free of charge transportation of weapons, so transfer of weapons from US to Ukraine. Unlike with the previous administration, where actually tens of billions were spent on assistance to Ukraine. Not much is flowing, frankly. Sometimes there have been some pauses in that American weapons being flown to Ukraine. Europeans are also providing their own weapons, and on some accounts, some weapons are really good, produced in Europe, no worse than the US. But there are some types of weapons, like, for instance, a Patriot missile system, which is the most advanced anti-aircraft air defense system. So this is US. They produce it. In Europe, they're only talking about maybe coming up with producing analog type of weapon to Patriot missiles. But Europe is very slow in changing their attitude in that respect. It's good that some people are waking up, maybe hearing the wake-up call, maybe with a big delay, because a full-scale war is raging for 4 years. There is a wide-scale acceptance in many parts of Europe that Russian aggression is a problem, not just for Ukraine, but for entire European security. And I think it's a valid point of view. But if you believe in that, then you would have to make swifter, quicker changes in terms of funding better your defense, capability of your troops to fight in the wars, maybe recruit more people for the military forces, improve the military procurement of weapons that you need, making lessons and drawing lessons from what you see, how Ukraine is fighting Russia. So using this window of opportunity for Europe, when Ukraine is withstanding pressure of Russia and keeping Russia at the gate, so to speak, Europe could have done more. And they're doing a lot, but maybe not fast enough. And that's why Europeans are important to us, especially in the last year, since Trump returned to the White House and he changed his tune on the war. He basically positions the US as a neutral country, not on the side of Ukraine. Instead, there was this coordinated European/Ukrainian position on war and peace, which is a big deal, and which is really preventing sometimes both Washington and Moscow from having it their way, because maybe they're ready for the grand bargain, but there is little problem. There is Ukraine, which just continues to fight, and there is Europe, which is supporting Ukraine. And it's very difficult for them, Trump and Putin, to actually reach some decisions and some agreements and bargains and treaties and sign treaties above the heads of Europeans, because Europeans will have to be involved. All right, so whatever the agreement is. And therefore, I think we need to continue to explore what we can get from this US administration. It's not easy, but we also should continue to work with Europeans, with everyone who can help us. For that matter, there is a bunch of great countries in the Pacific Ocean region, for instance, that help Ukraine, even some of them with weapons, sending some weapons and so on. So it's really a big coalition of willing, we call them coalition of willing, the countries willing to continue to help Ukraine. So it's probably not the kind of security guarantee that we would need, that we would get if we are within NATO, if we are protected by Article 5 within NATO. So it's not, it's short of it, but at the same time, it's much better than nothing, right? So therefore, Ukraine has actually walked a long way since the Budapest Memorandum, and I think we're now better protected, if not by security guarantees, then at least by massive security assistance packages that continue to exist, and I hope that both humanitarian assistance and the weapons would continue to flow to Ukraine, because it's very important for us to understand, even if this war stops, then Ukraine would still have to be supported for the new war not to start. right? Because it would be a very drastic mistake, a very foolish one, if someone in the West would decide that the moment there is some kind of ceasefire signed between Moscow and Kyiv, we should all relax and do away with sanctions and stop spending money on defense. That would be the most wrong lesson one can draw from this massive war. And Ukraine should continue to be supported in that scenario going forward.
Thanks. Thank you, Volodymyr. And let's move to the last question or last two questions. Now, I want to ask you also about the US-Iran war. And when the war started, I saw your post on social media that you compared it to the US invasions of Iraq in 1991 and 2003. So what is your take about this? And also obviously we see there has been a huge military success, but in terms of achieving political objectives such as regime change, they are still far away. And Iranian regime has shown remarkable resilience. It is kind of reproducing itself no matter how many layers of leadership US and Israelis are taking out. And what do you think about this war generally? And do you think US can achieve those political objectives, or how it's going
Yeah,
to?
I agree with you absolutely. I mean, first of all, this looks more like a blunder now, the strategic blunder, which may have repercussions and implications going forward years, if not decades. That's one thing. And of course, it's very hard to achieve a definite victory in situation when you don't define for yourself, like, what do you mean by victory? What is the main aim and objective of the operation? How do you go in? Okay, that decision being made, but how you go out? So no exit strategy again. And this is more like a typical chronicle malaise for American many administrations that went in many wars, easily defeating militarily their opponents. But then when it came to creation of new nation building, democratic institutions, elections, and having a durable governance systems, they have failed. They failed in Iraq, they failed in Afghanistan badly after many, many sacrifices and huge investments, financial investments. They had to leave from both places. And the short intervention in Libya brought similar, very much contradictory results as well on the ground. And the interesting thing was that Mr. Trump was really a voice for people who were critical for a long time of those long wars by the US. And a lot of people voted for Trump both times in 2016 and now in 2024, this last elections, hoping that he would indeed fulfill his promise of getting US out of the rest of the world, focusing on US, America first, stopping this forever wars, not sending in American soldiers and not hitting many regions in the world with American weapons. But he kind of lived up to this promise for the first year of his presidency, where he tried to position himself as a peace president, really, who's stopping wars. But now everything has changed from Venezuela on and now to Iran. And I think Venezuela played a bad service really to Trump, because he thought that Iran would somehow be like another Venezuela, completely, I guess, disregarding the major differences between the two cases. And right now, of course, Americans are in a difficult situation, as you say, yes, total devastation of Iran. But it looks like, if you just compare the chances of the two sides, that Iran might eventually claim strategic victory, if anything, because Americans are now thinking about stopping the war. Americans are now thinking maybe about claiming the victory, and Trump would come up and say, yeah, we have won, we bombed everything and so on. Iran is weakened dramatically, so we can stop and we have won the war. But at the same time, Iran and everyone else in the world would understand this is not a complete victory. The regime is still there. There is no regime change. There is nothing clear being said about the future military nuclear program. And I think Iranians, there is more chances now for Iranians to move even faster towards nuclear military program, actually. There is nothing, Iranians are even now talking about compensation for destruction cost to their cities and the facilities by Israel and the United States. And most importantly, there is a Hormuz Strait, which is blocked, and they can continue blocking it. I mean, there is no clear leverage right now that can be used to force Iran to unblock it. Not to mention that if Americans say we are done, our war ends, what about the strikes that Iranians are making against the countries in the Persian Gulf region? What if they decide to continue those strikes, even if Americans are leaving? So I think it's a big problem on the hands of the President Trump and his people right now, but that shows a lack of appropriate planning.
Thank you, Volodymyr. And I want to also ask about the impact of this war on Ukraine and Russia-Ukraine war. So you hear voices from both directions. On the one hand, from Ukrainian perspective, probably it's beneficial that Russia-friendly regime is theoretically removed in best case scenario, but it's on the other hand, Russia also benefits from the war, high energy prices, for instance, Europe becoming more dependent on Russian LNG, also diversion of focus from Ukraine to the Middle East. And also you mentioned that Ukraine lacks a lot of defensive infrastructure, including Patriot interceptors, for instance, and a lot of those weapons are used now in the Middle East. This will further make things harder. So how do you assess the current Middle Eastern conflict impact on?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say that no one is sorry for the hardships falling on the heads of Iranian regime and Iranian government. We, of course, sad often when we see that the civilians are dying, like that strike on the very first day in Gurov school, for instance. That's very, very unfortunate. It's very sad. No one in Ukraine is, is trying to be rejoicing about that. But in terms of the government of Iranian Islamic Republic of Iran, it's an enemy of Ukraine. It's a friend of our arch enemy, Russia, for a long time. It's part of this axis of evil, the way we see it, where we can surely include North Korea, maybe China, debatable issue, but maybe some other countries. But Iran deliberately helped helped Russia, sending those Shahed drones to Russia that Russia eventually learned to make themselves. But many of the people killed in Ukraine were killed by Iranian weapons. And there've been always discussions also about missiles, ballistic missiles primarily being sent by Iran to Russia as well. Not to mention that a few years ago, Iranians actually downed Ukrainian passenger airliner and never said properly sorry for that and never proceeded with the compensation process for the families of victims. So it's a long-standing list of grievances that Ukraine has with regard to Iran. No sympathy to Iran lost in Ukraine, but Ukraine is trying to use the situation to the best ability that it can. The negative side of this war for Ukraine, of course, is that everyone is now preoccupied, especially the United States, with war, and therefore not focusing on Ukraine and Russia and maybe on peace process. Another negative thing, of course, is there's so much weapons being spent on hammering Iranian positions. Some of those weapons could have been sent actually to Ukraine as well, but now, of course, there will be definitely shortage of many weapons, including air defense systems, that would have been sent to reinforce maybe Ukrainian Air Force defenses. So those are negative sides. But the positive side is that Ukraine quickly reacted to the situation with Iranian drone attacks on the countries of Persian Gulf, immediately established connection there, send their people there, send some of the drones, especially interceptor drones. The most important thing is that Ukraine has this experience. It's not even the drones themselves. It's more like a know-how that we have and that others don't. And surprisingly, some people in the West are still looking at the war that Russia is waging on Ukraine for 4 years. We're underestimating the role of drones and the drone warfare, including the United States. It seems to be that with American bases being attacked in the region and American allies in the Persian Gulf region, the most of the damage actually being done by drones and not even by missiles, ballistic or cruise missiles, which can be downed with very expensive missiles, but they can be downed. But drones is much more complicated kind of animal. They're not prepared. So I don't think that Zelenskyy is right when he hopes publicly that maybe if we help now countries of Persian Gulf against Iranian drones, they will probably help us to stop Russian aggression against Ukraine. Probably not. But at the same time, they will be appreciative and they will be grateful. And of course, Ukraine would actually get some good publicity for this, and Ukraine would probably get some money as well, because we're talking about countries that are affluent enough to pay for the Ukrainian services. And ultimately, I think rich countries, monarchies of the region, can contribute then decisively to the process of reconstruction and recovery of Ukrainian economy when the war is done. So either way, I think Zelenskyy and Ukraine intuitively, quickly moved, offering their services, and those services were accepted. Except for America, where it's complicated, because someone from US actually also asked for Ukrainian assistance on drones. But then President Trump in the recent days said that we don't need anything from Ukraine, definitely not from Zelenskyy. So this bad blood between the two, Trump and Zelenskyy, is shown here, unfortunately. But I think American generals actually are quite would be quite willing to get some of the Ukrainian experience.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Volodymyr. And I have a very last question, and then
Okay.
we finish on that. Now, you mentioned now the role of Ukraine not only as a security consumer, but also as a security provider in the Middle East, and sharing know-how. And Ukraine has this unique military experience, has a war-proven army, etc. And how do you see Ukraine as a state or as a regional actor in the future? Now, it's clear that Ukraine will survive as a state, Russia-Ukraine war, in whatever condition. And some observers even call Ukraine as a middle power or regional power or a military power with this unique experience, war-proven army, and this unique set of futures. So ideally, it could also be part of a Euro-Atlantic structure, but even if this process is more protracted also, as you anticipated, so how you see in this region the role of Ukraine and this power projection?
Yeah, well, first of all, I should say that, of course, Ukraine is on one hand weakened by the war, clearly, being hammered day and night for 4 years. Basically, it never stopped. Russian attacks never stopped. So there is a lot of industrial capacity that's been lost. There's a lot of agricultural capacity being lost. There is a danger even with Black Sea trade routes, for instance, and grain and being transported. We found a way out, but it took time. So on the one hand, Ukraine is definitely weakened and bleeding. On the other hand, yes, that's a price for gaining some very valuable experience about how to fight the contemporary war, how to fight this modern warfare, how to integrate newest military technologies. In the early days of the war, we were hoping and praying that the West would send us some weapons. Then Ukrainian military quickly master those weapons and use them against the Russian invaders. But even improving on those weapons, quite often there will be some creative improvements being made to the Western weapons by Ukrainian military that provided them with opportunity to use them even better. And eventually we came to this situation with drones and some other things where Ukraine is really one of the major powerhouses in terms of military technologies today. So yes, Ukraine can not only be a security consumer now for the Euro-Atlantic zone of security, but a security contributor. We're basically keeping the guard, against this very belligerent and aggressive Russian empire that we're dealing with. And if someone thinks that Russia only has a beef with Ukraine and don't want to touch anyone else in Europe, think again. I mean, in 2008. I remember how some people said, but Russia would never send its troops into Georgia outside of Ossetia and South Ossetia and Abkhazia, but they did, and then people said, no, but they would never use forces against Ukraine. It's just bigger country, bigger military. But they did. They took Crimea, they went into Donbass, but then some people said, okay, but that's a minor incursion, low intensity conflict. So we couldn't really realistically think about the full-scale war. And then the full-scale war happened. So what I'm trying to say that think again if you think that you're safe. You're not safe. If Ukraine doesn't stand, if Russia emerges victorious, they will be emboldened. They'll be emboldened to hit somewhere else. And I think that Ukraine understands now its role. And when Zelenskyy says that if you're thinking in Europe about European army, there you have it. There you have a backbone on the future European army being Ukrainian army. And then you can add elements to it. And then you can fund us, of course, so they can help us financially and will continue to be the backbone and the front front detachment really of the European army. And that's really changing the role of Ukraine. Not to mention that even under the most dark times, Ukraine continued to be a democracy in many ways. Ukrainians still cherish democracy. Ukrainians still value our pre-war democratic lifestyle. And that's also a message to a lot of people. When some countries in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, there is a liberal trend, anti-democratic trends, frankly. In Ukraine, it's on the contrary. People are just desperate and can't wait for the war to be over, so for Ukraine to return to its natural democratic self.
Thank you, Volodymyr. It was great pleasure having you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bidzina. Thank you for your invitation. Great conversation here. I enjoyed it very much so.